Well, last week we took a break from our series that we've been in, The Greatest Sermon, so that Pastor Gary could speak what God had put on his heart. Like I said, it was a great message. But this morning, I want to pick right back up there, and I want to talk to you about this whole subject of the greatest sermon. Now, we're not saying that the sermon I'm preaching is the greatest sermon. I'm preaching a sermon about the greatest sermon. You say, what is the greatest sermon? There have been a lot of sermons. Well, we're looking at what many would say. The reason we're calling it the greatest sermon is many would say that this sermon that we're talking about, known as the Sermon on the Mount, is the Magna Carta for the kingdom. It's the principles lined out wherewith all other kingdom principles are founded upon. Jesus, in 3 chapters, in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, he preaches this sermon. Now, we read it in about 5 or 10 minutes, but Jesus probably took several days to preach it. And like I said, in this sermon, Jesus teaches us how to have the principles to help us have successful Christian kingdom living. And it begins with what's known as the Beatitudes. And we preach through those. You say, what are the Beatitudes? Well, that's the attitudes that if you be having these attitudes, then you will be living a blessed life. How many of you want to live a blessed life? Come on. If you want to live a blessed life, say, that's me. So if you want to do that, then be having the attitudes in the Beatitudes. And if you live by those principles, you will be blessed. Then he goes into this amazing phrase, and that's where I want to pick up today, in Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. And he says, you are the salt of the earth. Jesus is telling you to be salty. Come on, turn to your neighbor and say, you salty. Come on, turn to your other neighbor and say, you salty. Now, if somebody tells you that today, if they look at you and say, you salty, they're probably telling you got a bad attitude, you need to get some things straight. Why are you so upset? Why are you acting offended or mad about something? But here, Jesus is saying, I want you to be salty. After telling them the powerful principles to live by in the Beatitudes, Jesus immediately then empowers them by these words that challenge them to live out this amazing truth. What is that truth? Here it is. Every generation of believers, from the disciples that he spoke to that day till now, are called to permeate society as agents of redemption and cultural change. You are called to change the world around you. Now think about what was going through these guys' minds. You got a fisherman, an IRS agent, some good old boys, the average, ordinary of society, and Jesus looks at him and says, you are the salt of the earth. You go be salty. The word for you in Greek here gets lost in our English translation in some ways, because in Greek there can be a plural you or there can be a singular you. And this word, if you really were to translate it accurately, is the singular, and it's actually very emphatic, you and you alone. It's funny because he's talking to a group of disciples, and to the group, he says you and you alone. Now, to us, that would mean, okay, the disciples are going to be the salt of the earth. None of the rest of us have a responsibility. But Jesus wasn't saying that. As he was talking to them collectively, he's talking to them individually. So he's emphatically saying to them, you, Matthew, and you alone are called to be the salt of the earth. You, John, and you alone are the salt of the earth. You, Peter, and you alone are the salt of the earth. So he's saying to them, individually, not just collectively. Now, when they all do it, there's a corporate dynamic that happens. But do you know today, Jesus is saying to us as the bridge, you, bridge, and you alone are the salt of the earth. But then he says to you individually, and you put your name in there, you, Nicole, if your name's Nicole, and you alone are the salt of the earth. You and you alone. Why? That he's being emphatic, but he's also personalizing. personalizing it. Why salt? Why salt? Of all the things he could have called us, why did he say salt? I have some salt in this bucket here. If you look at all of these salt packets, you could say these are going to salt the meal. But if you pull one of them out, he's saying you and you alone can salt a meal. You and you alone are the salt of your earth. See, we wouldn't put a high value on salt. But actually, salt, in short, we're going to get into some more specific reasons, but in short, here's what he's saying. Just like salt affects everything it touches, you're called to affect everything you touch. Everything in your world changes, should change, if you're salt, when you get into its environment. You say, what do you mean, Pastor Duane? Well, think about it. You've never heard anybody say, that is beefy salt I ate today for lunch. They say that's salty beef. Nobody says that's foodie salt. They say that's salty food. Why? Because the food can't change the salt. The beef can't change the salt. The salt changes the beef. So Jesus is saying, you are the change agent for your world. You are called to affect everything you come in contact with. Then why did he say you're the salt of the earth? Why didn't he say that you're the salt of your friends? You're the salt of whatever. But he says the earth. Why? You think of salting food. So why is he going to use a metaphor of salt and then say earth? Well, earth in Greek can include soil or ground, but it also means shore or region or land. Or it can mean the whole earth. So he's not saying you're the salt of the soil. He's saying you're the salt of the region around you. You're the salt of the world I put you in. He's saying you and you alone are the change agent for your world. Also, when you think about it, when God made Adam, where did he pull him from? He pulled him from the earth. Everybody say earth. So when he's saying you go salt the earth, he's saying you go salt the Adam, the people, the ones I created that are around you. You go salt mankind in your world. Some of you may remember the seed that we talked about in the parable of the good seed sown into the field, and how you are that good seed sown into the world, the earth, the environment around you by God the Father. And remember, the soil never tells the seed what to become. Come on, are you here? You remember that? So your environment can never dictate to you God's destiny over your life. Listen, the ocean can't tell a fish what to be. The soil can't tell a seed what to be, and your world can't tell you what to be. Never let the environment that God puts you in to cause you to grow dictate to you what you shall become, because you can be whatever God called you to be, and that environment was not there to define you. It's there to grow you. So when you get in an environment that seems hostile, just realize this environment cannot define me, but I'm called to grow in this place. Remember, you're a thermostat, not a thermometer. You're not just reading the atmosphere, you are defining or changing the atmosphere. So if salt affects everything, what are some things it affects? Well, first of all, salt makes you thirsty. Got anybody that's thirsty in here? Maybe some single people are thirsty, I don't know. If you don't understand that, just ask somebody under 30. It's a random fact. It has nothing to do with my message, but I found it very interesting. During the lifetime of an average American, they will consume 28,000 pounds of salt. And we collectively all just got thirsty. Now, that's not my message, but it did astound me at how much salt we consume as Americans, and it makes us thirsty. But listen, we're not called to be thirsty. We're called to get into a world and make it thirsty, not for the things of the world, but for the things of God. My life should make people thirst after living water. My life should make people be thirsty for the things of God. Be thirsty for God to do something great in their life. Come on, are you here? Another thing it does is it makes you thirsty, but it also fights odor. I've traveled all over the world, and we many places we've taken teams and we create latrines. They call them long drops, where you dig a hole 8-10 feet in the ground, and that becomes their bathroom. It becomes their toilet. And we may think that's gross, but they think it's a huge blessing, because if you have no place to go as a community, then that's great to have an outhouse where you can go and not just have to go some random place. Now you say, well, that's gross. I want my restroom inside my house. Well, they don't, because it just drops down there and stays. There's nowhere for it to, there's no sewage system. So if it's in your house, it's going to smell the whole house. Come on, are you here? But I learned something years ago that if you've ever walked into one of those, I mean, it's pungent. If you walk into a long drop that's been around for a long time, it's got a long smell. And you walk in and it'll hit you like a ton of bricks. But do you know you can throw some salt down in there, and that salt will take away the odor. Can I just be blunt with you today? The world stinks. There's a lot of things about society that stinks right now. If you go on social media, all the news you hear stinks most of the time. But can I tell you that we're called to make the world smell better? That our life can literally make life smell better. We can change it. Salt water can even be used to create electricity. So there's powerful things that can be done with salt. We could go on, but you get the idea. Now, you could take a lot of these things that we could list about salt, and you could put them under 3 categories. I'm going to give you those 3, and then I'm going to get out your way. Number 1, we're going to go to lunch. Number 1, first of all, salt is a preservative. Salt is a preservative. This would have been the most common and valued use in biblical times. Now, they had no refrigeration, so it's the only way they could preserve meat. You can imagine, my father-in-law raises a beef for us every year, raises a cow for us, and then we have that cow processed and we put it in our freezer, and it lasts us about a year. We would have a great waste of money if we did not take that beef, if we didn't have a freezer to put that beef in. Now listen, if you don't like beef, God bless you. Vegan may be heaven to you. Vegan is hell to me. What's heaven to one person is hell to another person. I understand a lot of people don't like beef, but I'm a meat eater, so I cannot imagine a world where there is no beef. Can I get a witness? And listen, I know that my wife is thinking, Duane, you're going to get so many emails from this. If you want to email me to complain about my comments about beef, my email is cody@findthebridge.com. So anything unpleasant you want to say, send it to him. Now listen, I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying that in their day, there weren't a lot of vegans, and so they needed meat, and the only way to preserve it was with salt. So it literally many times was the difference between life and death. It was so important that it had the highest of value. Roman soldiers were even paid many times in salt rather than currency. It was that valuable. Wars were fought over salt, literally. And at one point in the Roman government, it was so valuable that it was sold and traded ounce for ounce with gold. Can you imagine if you went to buy some salt and you got it's a bag of salt and you went and plunked it on the counter at Walmart and they said it was trading at the same level as gold and they said, "Oh, thank you, that'll be $7,342.15. You would say, "What am I buying, gold?" And they would say, "Yes." That's what it was like. It was that valuable. Do you know you're valuable? You're not only valuable to God, I hope you know that today. You are valuable to God, but you're valuable to the world around you. Jesus is saying, you are the most precious thing I could put in your world. You are the most valuable thing I could place in your world. God loved the world around you so much, he placed you in that world to be a preservative, to make a difference. And you, just like salt, can change everything you touch. You can change your city. You can change your street. You can change your community. You can change your school. You can change your job. You can change your family. Your job may seem terrible to you, but have you ever thought that maybe, just maybe, God put you in that job so that you could be the one thing to preserve it? And if he pulled you out of it, there might not be any salt or preservative left in that environment. Come on, are you here? Your school may be godless, but it's not godless if you're there. You may feel like it's godless, but if God puts you in that environment, you're there to make a difference. Your family, you may think that your family is so dysfunctional. You may say, "Well, I wish that I was born in a nice Christian home like some of these other folks. I tell you what, I was just born in this stupid little family of mine. Ain't nobody ever done nothing." And, and maybe, I'm kind of being funny, but maybe it's not so funny. Maybe it was an abusive situation, or maybe this thing happened or that thing happened. And while God cares about that, he also believes in you enough. Although he didn't do those things, he knows that he can use you, and maybe you are the change agent in your family that's going to make a difference. Listen, what if you're the first one that's going to get born again and go to church and love Jesus and raise your family and get married and stay married and not get a divorce? What if you're the first one to get a degree? What if you're the first one to do the right thing? What if you're the first one to get off drugs and stay off drugs? What if you're the first one to turn it around? Maybe God puts you in that family so that you could be the one to turn it all around. Maybe you are the salt to your family. Listen. My dad left my mom when I was 13. I was abused by a family member as a child. I've had all kinds of issues and stories. There's so many skeletons in my family's closet. It would scare Halloween if you looked in there. But one day I realized God thought enough of me and my family to say, I'm going to take a little hairlip boy and I'm going to throw him right in the middle of that family, and he's going to change that family's dynamic. And I don't care what you've come from. I don't care what your family has been like. You can be the change. Maybe, just maybe, you're the one going to turn it all around. Maybe you'll be the one to break materialism. You'll be the one to live for something bigger than yourself. Number two, first of all, salt is a preservative. Number two, salt is a cleansing agent. It's a cleansing agent, or you could say a healing agent. I was born with a cleft lip and palate. Most of you would know that. I have a scar right here. I have a scar on this side where they removed half of one of my ribs when I was 12 weeks old to make a hard palate in the roof of my mouth. And so my hard and soft palate are basically man-made. And so they're very porous, and because of that, they they couldn't take out my tonsils as a kid. When I got tonsillitis, they had to leave them in there because if they took my tonsils out, it would just create a huge hole and I wouldn't be able to chew or eat or cause a lot of problems. So they had to leave them in there. So whenever I get a sinus infection all my life, and when I was a kid, I would get many of them because in the wintertime, when sinuses would act up in the fall, it would drain into my tonsils and they would catch all that stuff and it would cause infection. And I'll go to the doctor. If they don't know my condition, they'll put a flashlight, like they do. They look back and they say, ah, and you go, ah, and they go, ugh. Like freaks them out. And they're like, why do you still have your tonsils? And I have to educate the doctor on why I still have my tonsils. Oh, yeah, now I understand. Oh, right. I was thinking, why don't you remove those things? They're causing a problem. But I learned at an early age, I can stop that infection if I'll gargle with warm salt water. That it's a healing, cleansing, purifying agent. When you go to the dentist and they mess with all your gums and they get all sore, they'll tell you wash or rinse with warm salt water and it'll purify, it'll heal your gums. There's a lot of hurt in the world. There's a lot of pain in society. You and I are God's healing agent to the world. What if people gargled your life? What if your life was so healing that when people tasted of your life, it brought healing to a hurting world? We are called to heal the world around us. As a cleanser, it's also a purifier. It's an antiseptic. Brits in the olden days used to even use it to get the stains out of their teacups. It was that powerful. The very existence of your life is a purifier to the world around it. We're called to purify, to heal, to bring emotional healing, spiritual healing, and even physical healing to our world. When we salt the world around us with our life, we're bringing healing to the people around us. And finally, number 3, salt is a seasoning. It adds flavor. It adds flavor. Jesus said, you're the salt of the earth. And then he goes on and says, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? Do you realize that you and I are the spice of life? Remember, you and you alone are the salt of the earth. You make food taste better. So basically, the world is British food. In other words, it has no taste, like British food. If you've ever eaten food in England, you know what I'm talking about. Forgive all my British friends. All my British friends, just send your emails to Cody. Find the bridge. But we are called to bring flavor to the world around us. You spice things up a little bit. But here's the thing. The flavor that I am on the inside is what people taste when they experience my life. So if I'm bitter, they'll taste bitterness. I add bitter spice. If I'm offended, I add a not so nice taste to the world around me. If I'm angry all the time, I'm not adding the right spice. But if I'm filled with love and joy and peace, then the world can taste and see that the Lord is good. The Bible says if I'm filled with love, I'll add the spice of love. The second part of this verse is confusing. He said, you're the salt of the earth. If the salt loses its flavor, how does salt lose its flavor? I don't know about you, but when I think about that to myself, I think that's crazy. We just talked about how salt affects everything else. Nothing affects salt. So how does salt lose its flavor? How can that happen? Well, keep reading. It says, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing, because it has no value anymore, but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. It has no value. Jesus even talked about this in Mark 9, verse 50. He said, salt is good. Everybody say, salt is good. But if the salt loses its flavor, how will you season it? Have salt in yourself, he said, and have peace with one another. Luke 14:34, salt is good. He said it again. But if the salt has lost its flavor, how's it going to be seasoned? Again, lose its saltiness, lose its flavor. What does that mean? That phrase, it was used it was a colloquialism of the day, and it means to become foolish, stupid, or mad, like crazy. So he's saying, he's giving us kind of a deeper meaning here. He's saying, if salt loses its flavor, if it becomes stupefied, if it becomes, that's crazy. It's mad to think of salt actually not being salty. So then how does that happen? Well, again, to really understand what he's saying this is crazy unless you get what would have happened in the day. So remember, I said salt was very valuable. If something is extremely valuable, what do we do many times on a black market? What are they going to do to make more money? They're going to dilute the purity of that thing and then try to sell it for pure value. If you can get, you know the difference in 10 karat gold and 14 karat gold and 24 karat gold. You can't sell 10 karat gold at the same value as 24 karat gold. Why? Because it's not pure. 24 karat gold is pure, so it has greater value. So they would mix other things in with the salt and sell it as if it was pure. How many times in our life are we letting things dilute what God has called us to be, so we're not really the thing that he's destined us to be, so we don't have the same effectiveness? He was saying you can't salt can't quit being salt. Salt can't lose its flavor unless you dilute it. Then it's not pure salt and it won't have the same effect. So it won't be as much of a purifier. It won't be as much of a cleanser. It won't be as much of a preservative. It won't be all the things it was meant to be if you mix it with other things. So what's diluting your life? What is trying to take away your saltiness? You know, if you want to look at it a little bit different, you can, if you cut cocaine. Ain't nobody in here ever known what I'm talking about. Maybe somebody did, praise the Lord. Somebody could testify to this. If you cut I'm getting a witness back up in here. If you cut cocaine, the way they cut it, watch this. They take Coke and they mix it with salt. You say, wait a minute, Pastor Duane, that doesn't make sense. Yeah, hold on, stay with me. They're taking what is perceived to be the higher value, and they're mixing it with salt, which they believe to be of no value. And then they're selling the commodity they believe to be value at a higher price than what it would even be worth if you valued it. You say, what are you talking about, Pastor Duane? Listen, the devil and the world will always discount the salt in your life, and he'll try to take the little bit of Jesus you get for 20 minutes on a Sunday morning and throw it into your Monday through Saturday and then dilute who you really are. But he's going to try to tell you that the value is in that paycheck you get, or the value is in people's approval, or the value is in all the things that the world has put a premium on, and all the time you are the valuable commodity. The salt is what is valuable, not the Coke. The Coke is going to give everybody a temporary high, but they're going to get over it, and then it's going to cost them more than they're willing to pay. It's going to keep them longer than they're willing to stay, and it's going to mess up their life and their future. But the salt can change I wish I had somebody that helped me today. See, the problem is we're on a low sodium diet. I have high, or no, I don't have. I had. This isn't a faith statement. This is a reality. I had high blood pressure. So the doctor wants to take me off of sodium because we see salt as bad. The problem with society and the church in America is we've decided to go on a low sodium diet. We've decided to dumb down the salt. But at the bridge, we've decided we're going to go salt the world every Sunday afternoon when we go to Quakertown and feed people that need food. And at the end of the month when we have trunk or treat and invite thousands of people to say, listen, this thing you value called Halloween is nothing compared to the value of love and grace and joy and peace and all the things God's called us to. I don't know about you, but I don't want the world to be on a low sodium diet because of me. Maybe the Jesus blood pressure in the world needs to go up. So listen. We're called to make a difference. The use of salt was so valuable and so purposeful that in the Old Testament there were many covenants. There was what's known as the salt covenant. Most people have never heard of a salt covenant. You see it first mentioned in the Bible in Leviticus chapter 2, verse 13. B means the last part of the verse. It says, with all, everybody say all, your offerings you shall offer salt. This establishes a very, very powerful biblical truth that every sacrifice had to have salt. Think about that. Think about that. Millions of sacrifices over hundreds of years. Every lamb, every turtle dove, everything that was offered had to have salt. So you couldn't offer a sacrifice without putting salt on it. Jesus actually doesn't quote the Old Testament a lot. He did a handful of times, but he confirmed it when he quotes that verse in Mark 9:49. He says, and every sacrifice shall be salted with salt. Now think about this. One of the most common sacrifices in the Old Testament was a lamb. Another one would have been bread. We know that Jesus is the Lamb of God slain from the foundations of the earth. Watch this. He's the bread of life, but he's never called salt. Why? Because you're the salt, and you're the salt. You're the salt, and 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 you're the salt. We're not the sacrifice. Jesus is the lamb. You and I will never be referred to as the lamb. We're sheep under a shepherd, but we're not a lamb sacrifice. We're not the bread of life. We're never going to be what Jesus was. He's the one and only sacrifice, but his sacrifice has no potency in the world without your life. If you're not the salt that God called you to be, in your world, then guess what? Jesus' sacrifice, the covenant that he made, isn't established until somebody becomes the salt that they were called to be. I just believe that there's some salty people up in here. You are the redemptive change agent that God's going to use to take that sacrifice of Jesus to your world, and you'll preserve it and purify it and cleanse it with your life. You were destined to make a difference in the earth. You are called to be the finishing part of God's covenant. Watch. I'm almost done. Watch this. Then he switches in verse 14. Come on, tell your neighbor, you're salty. Come on, tell your other neighbor, you're salty. Then he switches metaphors in verse 14. He says, you, same word, you and you alone are the light of the world. A city that's set on a hill cannot be hidden. He's probably referencing Jerusalem. But to us, the church, that city is the church. In the New Testament, that city, so he could be saying, Bridge, you and you alone are a city set on the hill. Light can represent a lot of things, but the most important thing it represents is revelation. So we're called as a church to bring revelation of Jesus to a hurting world. We're called to bring light and life and love into the dark world around us. And he doesn't want us hiding. He says in verse 15, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but they put it on a lampstand. And he gives it to all and it gives light to all who are in the house. When you're born again, when you become a Christ follower, when you ask him in your life, God the Father lights your candle through Jesus, but then this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. If you were raised in Sunday school, that song is ringing in your head. Hide it under a bushel. No. I'm going to let it shine. Chris said it earlier. God the Father in Genesis, it says that the world was without form and void. Chaos was upon the face of the deep, and darkness covered the earth. And great was the darkness. It's the beginning. It's telling how dysfunctional. All the particles were there, all the gases, all the protons, neutrons, but they were all chaotic. And then God hovered and he said, let there be light. Did you know your life was chaotic? It was out of order. It was dysfunctional. It was filled with darkness. And Holy Spirit hovered over you. And he said, let there be light. But then once he lit your candle, now he's saying to you, go be the light. I told you Jesus never referred to himself as salt, but he did refer to himself as light. So he is the light of the world, but he's put in us, and we can reflect that light. See, really, you have no light in yourself. You're just like the moon reflecting the light of the sun. So we're all just a bunch of moonies. We're just reflecting the light of the sun. In verse 16, he says, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Listen, we don't work for our salvation, but we do work from our salvation. We don't work for approval from God, but out of our approval from God, we do works that glorify God. We reflect the light of the sun, S-O-N, not the sun, S-U-N. I've been reading a book. I'm landing this plane. I've been reading a book. It's transformed my life. Actually, I didn't read it. I listened to it on audiobook. I highly recommend it. As a matter of fact, I'm going to do a very Texan thing. I double dog dare you to get this book. I'm like throwing down. If you're from Texas, you understand. There's I dare you, and then there's I double dog. And a dog is spelled D-A-W-G, dog. Dog. I double dog dare you to get this book. Bob Goff, G-O-F-F. Everybody, always. There's one story, I can't do it justice. I'm kind of this is a, what do you call it? Spoiler alert. But I can't do it justice in the time that I have. So get the book. It's at the end. Your life will be transformed before you get to the end anyway. You can read all the details. But Bob Goff was an attorney, decided to love everybody. Always. His stories are outrageous, what God did with an ordinary guy that just started loving people. And he ends up by, you could say accidentally, I would say providentially, he ends up in Uganda. And he finds out that there's all these witch doctors that are sacrificing children. Human sacrifices. And nobody has ever prosecuted any of them or brought them to justice because they're scared of them, number one, and they can never find a victim because they kill them after they torture them, they murder them and sacrifice them to demonic spirits. Bob Goff thought this is not right, so he began to inquire about prosecuting one of them, and finally he gets the opportunity. There is a 9-year-old boy that gets rescued. Really, because some of Bob Goff's friends called him and said, we're witch doctors that got born again. And they said, there's a witch doctor taking a boy. We know where he is. What do we do? He said, go get him. Rescue him. So they did. He had already mutilated the boy, but he was alive. That little boy testifies. They had a court. He got a judge that would take the case. And the little boy testified, and this man went to jail. He went to the worst prison in Uganda, one of the worst prisons in Africa, maybe the world. And to say it was a death sentence is beyond the truth. No one comes out. Everyone goes in. They never come out. He was dying. He was going to die for sure. And so you think, this is great. God used him to love that little boy. The thing is, it's easy to love the little boy who is the victim because he's the victim. But then God does the unthinkable. And he says, I want you to love the witch doctor. And he said, God, I can't do that. Do you know what he did? As if God didn't know, or as if somehow we think that we care more about justice than God does. But there's this little phrase in the Bible that mercy triumphs over justice and the mercy of God. Now, he still needed to be punished for what he did. I'm not saying that, and he is being punished for it naturally, but he still deserved forgiveness. And while God hated the sin and the results of the sin, he loved the sinner. And so Bob did the unthinkable, and he went into that dark prison, risked his life. The guards said, you don't belong here. They can have no visitors. But he said, you don't understand. I'm a special consulate to the Ugandan embassy. Let me in. And so they let him in. When he gets there, this guy has little voodoo dolls of him, and he's poking them with pins, saying, I'm cursing you. But Bob loves hell right out of this man, and he gets born again. And Bob discovered that This guy, like all of us, was only inflicting pain because of the pain that had been inflicted upon him, and that hurt people, but healed people can heal people. And so he shares the love of Jesus. He gets born again. He baptizes him. Then he has him stand up and testify. And his testimony, Bob said, was ridiculous. He got it all wrong. He messed up the story of Jesus. He butchered the plan of salvation. But the whole prison gets born again and gets baptized, and all these men that were going to bust hell wide open get the light of Jesus coming into their life. Why? Because one man said, I'll be a little salty and I'll be a light in a dark place. Listen, there is darkness all over the world. While I'm preaching, a child is being abused. While I'm sharing this right now, somebody is being murdered. Somebody is being beaten. Something horrible is happening. The unthinkable is happening this moment. But when we walk out of these doors, we are missionaries, and we hit the mission field, and we can go turn on the light in Denton High School and in UNT and in the highways and the byways to those who are broken and destitute. Are you ready? Because you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Go salt the sacrifice Jesus made on the cross. Go turn on the light in the darkest places. Can you stand to your feet if you're ready for it? Lift your hands and say, let there be light.
Darkness in your eyes. There's no question in your mind.